Hi, I'm Alex and this is Tank Tested, and beside me is a 20-gallon aquarium that I'm going to be setting up as a low-tech and low-maintenance aquascape. Now, it really does need to be low maintenance because I'm setting this up at my parents' house, who don't have a background in aquariums. So every 6 weeks or so, I'm going to come over to do maintenance, and that's pretty much all this tank is going to get. So with that in mind, let's get started. I'm starting the build with a roll of privacy film. This is the type of privacy film that uses static electricity to hold on to glass. To assist in that, I'm adding some water to the exterior of my aquarium. That way, when I add my cling film, it holds on nice and tight. So with this cling film, there is a plastic protective sheet. You want to remove that and then add the privacy film to your glass as quickly as possible. That extra layer of plastic is there so no dust builds up on the side of the privacy film that's going on the glass. Then I take a piece of plastic, maybe a credit card or a library card, and I rub out all of the bubbles from the cling film. Doing that allows me to have a beautiful soft white background right off the bat. And it's really easy to remove if I ever want to. Now, I did this on the front of the tank, but I'm going to rotate the tank, so now it's at the back of the tank. And in doing so, I've got a beautiful background. And I can hide some equipment back there behind the tank, or maybe my water conditioner, and it's much harder to see. For the substrate of this tank, I'm going to be using Ultim Nature Contrasoil. This is a finely grained aquasoil that I've really grown to love over the last year or so. I'm not going to add too much of it though, because I want this tank to have a big patch of sand. So I'm just piling it up in one corner of the tank, maybe 3 or 4 inches thick. That's pretty much all the aquasoil I need for this whole setup. I'm smoothing it out so that it's equally distributed, and then I'm going to add my one big piece of Hardscape. This is a piece of spiderwood, and I'm not sure of its exact position yet, but I'm just going for something that kind of breaks up my right hand and left hand side of the tank. This one piece of wood is maybe a little bit too vertical for a traditional perfectly scaped aquascape, but I think for a setup like this, it works okay. And my only other option would be to dramatically alter how I lay down my wood or to cut the wood. And since this was a quick and dirty hardscape, I didn't worry about it too much. Now, I've got a few more little sticks. I believe these are manzanita sticks, so it's a slightly different type of wood, but it's what I had on hand. And I'm just adding them underneath and surrounding that big piece of spiderwood so that it feels a little bit more incorporated in the hardscape. I don't want it to feel like it's just a piece of wood sitting on an embankment. I want there to be roots kind of stretching out into what will eventually be a sandy bottom. Now, this is a really, really fast hardscape. If you really want a great hardscape, one of the best pieces of advice I can give is to set up your hardscape, look at it empty for a few days, and keep tinkering with it. Because over time, you'll discover things that maybe don't look as good as you initially thought. But for now, I think this is a workable setup. I'm also going to be adding a little bit of pool filter sand. As with all of the products in this video, I have links in the description. So if you want to get anything that I have in this video, you can. This is a really great pool filter sand. It's the substrate I use in my 150-gallon aquascape. It's fine, but not so fine that it creates a lot of murk in the tank, and it's not really at risk of getting sucked up into the filters. In this setup, because I'm not planting in the sand, I'm just putting a very, very thin layer. Maybe a 1/4 inch of sand ultimately at the bottom of the tank. Just enough to cover the bottom, add a little bit of visual interest, but not so much that it's going to be a pain. Because one of the keys with white sand is every few months, the best thing you can do is just take a siphon, suck it all up, and replace it with a new layer of sand. So I always try to use just enough sand that it covers the bottom, does what I need it to do, but not so much that I've got to replace a huge amount of sand every 3 or 4 months. Now I'm adding a few pieces of dragonstone. This is just a little bit of rock to break up my substrate and sand border. Just a little bit of visual interest. Most of this is going to get grown over with plants. It's not going to be super apparent, but it'll be there. And for someone that's detailed and looking up close, it's just a little something to catch your eye. And because it's about the same color as my sand, it doesn't look too unnatural. I'm trying to design something that is subtle and simple and not going to take too much attention away from the plants that I'm going to be planting. I'm also trying to set up a scape that's relatively open. You see, the entire left-hand side of the tank is going to be a big open area. With the hardscape and substrate in place, it's time to start planting. I'm starting by planting a little bit of water wisteria. These are all trimmings from my 150-gallon tank, and water wisteria is one of those great plants that's pretty fast growing, doesn't require a lot, has really beautiful leaf structures, and does well with or without CO2. This tank is not going to have CO2, and these plants will do just fine. Next up, I'm adding a little bit of Ludwigia repens Super Red Mini. Now, that's what I think this is. It may be a different variety of Ludwigia, but it's close enough. It's a relatively low-growing, bushy Ludwigia. It's definitely something that my parents are going to have to trim every month or two, but it shouldn't grow too out of control. In the back, I'm also planting another variety of Ludwigia, Ludwigia arcuata. It's a higher growing plant that again doesn't need CO2, but it should fill in that back area nicely. Next up, I'm planting a little bit of Rotala colorata. Now, this is a good mid-ground plant. It really does great at about 8 to 12 inches tall, so this is maybe a little bit misplanted, but with some proper training by trimming off the tops, it should stay relatively bushy and will make a nice mid-ground plant. With its small leaves, it'll make a nice little delicate accent. And in a low CO2 or no CO2 tank, it should stay relatively green, which is going to be a nice contrast with the Ludwigia right next door. I'm also adding a little bit of Java fern. Now, it's not the healthiest Java fern. I took it from kind of a rough patch in my 150. Hopefully in this setup, it'll bounce back. In addition, I'm adding a few crypts. These will melt away, but eventually they'll bounce back, and I think they'll add a really lovely, different, warm, dark leaf shape to the aquascape. So at the end of the day, this is a pretty densely planted aquascape, which is how you want to plant an aquascape if you can. The denser you plant, the better you're going to do, because all of those plants are going to be competing for nutrients, which means that algae in the tank won't have a big chance to get established. One of the biggest problems with a new setup is runaway algae growth. You can limit that by adding CO2 or having a lower light cycle, so less light into the tank. But another really easy way to limit an algae explosion is to heavily plant your tank from day one. I also added just a little bit of Hydrocotyl tripartita in the foreground here. Hopefully this is a nice carpeting plant that won't reach too high. If there's enough light, this plant will just kind of creep along the substrate. It's a beautiful 4-leaf clover looking plant that adds a totally different leaf shape to the aquarium. Now all that's left is adding water to the aquascape. To make sure I don't disturb my hardscape too much, I'm pouring all of my water into a glass jar first. The water overflows that jar in a very distributed pattern, which reduces its impact on the hardscape. If you were to pour water right in, you would spread all your hardscape all over the place, and you'd be at risk of uprooting your plants and just destroying all of the hard work that you did. So that's a really great way to add water to your aquascape. Now that the tank is full, let's fast forward a little bit. All right, so it's been a week since I filled the tank. A week of the filter running and the plants adapting. Some of the wood has bacteria growing on it. It's pretty normal to have that clumpy white fuzz growing on your wood, especially when you first add it to a tank. Nothing to worry about. A lot of the plants have started to melt, and that's also not terribly surprising, especially for some plants like crypts, which you can see here, have melted almost entirely away. That's pretty normal, especially when a nutrient load in the water shifts a little bit. It'll come back, not too worried about it. The Java fern is still looking a little rough. It'll probably take a few months for it to fully come into its own, and that has nothing to do with me planting it. That has to do with the fact that the Java fern that I added to this tank was in pretty rough condition when I started. I've added 3 nearite snails and 1 Amano shrimp to this setup to help control for algae. Now, this tank is not going to have any fish in it for quite a while. My parents didn't want a setup that was high maintenance. They wanted something that they could just kind of ignore and I would deal with when I came over. So right now, my plan is to leave this running for around 6 weeks empty, with the exception of the 1 Amano shrimp and 3 nearite snails. And then I may add a colony of cherry shrimp to the tank, depending on whether or not it feels stable enough to handle them. Because the key to success with cherry shrimp and other small shrimp is a stable and established aquarium. Now, the filter on this tank is a UNS canister filter, hang-on back canister filter. It's running right now and it's completely silent. I'm actually really impressed. I have not plugged this filter in before this week, and I'm not used to a filter being quite this quiet. So I really can honestly recommend the UNS filter. It's a really wonderful setup and it's pumping a pretty heavy flow. But the thing that I'm most impressed with is how quiet it is. And that's important because right now this is set up in what used to be my old bedroom. It's now a guest bedroom. And if any guest were to ever come here, I'd want them to not hear an aquarium in here. I'd want it to be a nice, silent, beautiful thing to look at, not something that keeps them up at night. Hopefully, I will show this again to you in a few months once it's more established and you can see how a low-tech aquascape progresses. If you like this, hit subscribe so you can see the update on this tank in a few months. This is planted right now, so it will be a few months before it's ready to show again, but I do plan on showing you what has happened with it, good or bad. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you next time.